Hello, hello, Out and Equal team. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, well, quite a few things, but primarily LGBTQ plus history, intersectionality, and why it's important to just tell the truth when it comes to histories and why it's so hard for people to do that, or why there's so much refusal for that to get done as it relates to LGBTQ plus people in the past and very much in the present. It doesn't always have to be Pride Month when we talk about LGBTQ plus history, but it is a good reminder to be plugged in, to listen to our communities, to listen to our hearts, and to move forward. My name is Blair Imani. I am an author, an educator, and an influencer as of the 2 years now. And it's been the joy of my life to try to connect the dots for people, to remind people, or to sometimes enlighten people for the very first time about the many, many aspects of our community that are neglected, under-discussed, and all with the goal of just trying to show people the way to themselves. Not the way behind me, but the way to really have a loyalty to themselves and to move forward. This touches so many different aspects of our lives. And I actually started out in history and in communications. My series, Now Smarter in Seconds, is essentially talking points about sociology and LGBTQ plus history. And it's really all with this goal of trying to synthesize this important and crucial information and make it tangible and accessible to people in ways that are necessary, because I think one of the worst things that we see with the LGBTQ plus community, and many of us in it, is not learning about people like us until we get to college. And many of us don't go to college. I mean, it's very expensive in the US. And I think it's a shame that there's so many political efforts right now dissuading teachers and entire school districts from talking about the fact that LGBTQ plus people exist. We are here. We've always been here. We're proud, and folks just need to get used to it. And better yet, affirm it and uplift it. So when we talk about Pride with Pride Month, there's such an emphasis on the Stonewall Inn, and rightfully so. But let's take a look at the people who really shifted and had this conversation. And to me, even though I am a historian and I can get very focused on the individual particular dates and times and people, it's less important to me about who threw the first brick or the first shot glass or the first handful of quarters, and much more interesting to me to look at the social unrest that preceded the Stonewall Inn taking place. I always like to focus on Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Of course, there's Stormy. There's so many other people that we can discuss as well, but I really want to emphasize and highlight the trans women of color who are leading these efforts. Something that's important to note when we talk about LGBTQ plus history is this concept of posthumous outing. So posthumous meaning after death, and outings being, people who in their lifetime never declared themselves in the terminology we use today, and that's totally fine and valid. That being said, there are people throughout history who embodied queerness, transness, and I want to dive into that first before I go back to talking about the Stonewall Inn, because while it's important to talk about what happened in 1969, I think it's also important for us to recognize the role of colonization, the role of capitalism, the role of systems of oppression that have really shaped society into this narrow binary of man and woman, and man being masculine and decided at birth, and woman being feminine, and all of these other things, including a wage gap, and that these two only things that exist, this is all with massive air quotes, by the way, are halves of a whole that must be made complete, and they can only enjoy themselves in the bedroom if they're creating more people. And it's such an interesting phenomenon that is so narrow, especially when you look at the course of human history and the fact that we do not always arrange ourselves in this way, nor is it the only way to do so. The human experience is so expansive, and I think once that knowledge can be attained and transmitted and understood by people, it's quite liberating, because you start recognizing that even in attempting to define straight, we get into such a narrow confine of what that means. What does it mean? Often it means a cisgender person. Well, not always, because there are transgender people who are straight as well. But you would have people who will grow up their entire lives believing, and still many people today, believing that if you are a man, then you have always been a man, and you can be nothing but this one narrow version of a man, and that you must be with a woman, and that is the correct way of being. If we go back to the 1930s and 40s when the word straight even came out, this was something that was not devious. So even the term straight itself includes this air of heteronormativity. Now, something that I said as an aside, but is important to affirm, is that there are trans people and gender non-binary people who are themselves straight. And so when people say that there are no straight people in the LGBTQ plus community, they are actually being trans exclusionary. So that's an interesting fact and something to remind ourselves of as well, as I corrected myself actively. It's an ongoing learning process. But when we think about this heteronormativity, it's so limiting. We have things like in sex education classes, when we learn about puberty, we describe young boys as having these uncontrollable urges. We talk about women in these very, kind of flowery ways, but then stigmatize people for having periods, and then also neglect to consider that we are entire humanity. And I keep holding this kind of invisible ball because that's how I view humanity, as something that cannot be fully contained, but that's something that has constantly been put into a box. So in less abstract terms, if we go back to pre-colonial African societies, we know from Dr. Oyoronke Uyuwumi, who talked about the invention of women making an African sense of gender, how in pre-colonial African societies like the Yoruba peoples, for example, gender was not something that was a part of social construction. That might be very difficult for us today, since we have so many gender reveals that have caused wildfires in my area, but that also cause serious harm to the mental health of queer and trans youth, and to cis youth as well, if we're going to be really honest about it. Gender really harms everyone. But in these pre-colonial societies, the Yoruba peoples didn't arrange themselves according to gender. The conceptualization of woman did not exist. And if we think about in Euro-colonial societies, that might be better understood as Western societies, but Western is a relative term, so I like to say Euro-colonial, because that's what it was European colonization. When the Europeans came to the Yoruba peoples, they started to legislate what it meant to be a woman, and what that meant according to your anatomy, what was decided, and then start having assumptions around gender starting from birth. And these things were legislated and implemented, and we still see that very much today. We've started to see some movement today with the gender marker X being part of what is, understood as people being outside of this binary that is really so loosely held together. It goes back to the ancient philosophers like Aristotle saying that a citizen is only a person with a member, wink, and that women are not part of that and are not citizens. And so we have really, unfortunately, had this very long, meandering journey of history trying to retroactively take discoveries like the fact that intersex people exist, like the fact that transgender people exist, especially and particularly in societies where gender is something socially enforced, that these things are unnatural. And I use these air quotes because it is so far from the truth. So many things that human beings do defy the rules of nature, whether it's putting on makeup, whether it's inventing the metaverse. And so when we think expansively about who we are, it can be something liberating, it can be something exciting. I've been recently doing a lot of research around ancient queer people, whether it's Kalonymus, who was an amazing Jewish genderqueer scholar and philosopher who wrote about gender dysphoria back in these medieval ages. I think that she was born in 1286, talking about what it felt like to experience gender dysphoria, what it meant to be born in a way that people were receiving you in a way that you did not receive yourself. And so this has been around since the medieval ages. But what has also been the case is that we have queer folks like Sappho in ancient Greece talking about her affections for women. But when we talk about these folks today, we might understand Kalonymus as a transgender person, as a genderqueer person. We might understand Sappho as a lesbian. Well, and we should understand her as a lesbian because she was from the Isle of Lesbos, so she was literally a lesbian either way. But what's also fascinating is that during the times when these people lived, in particularly Sappho, the understanding of what it meant to be queer was it kind of non-existent. It didn't mean that queer people didn't exist. It was just before the time when people in Greek society were viewing attraction, whether it's romantic or sexual attraction to people, as being either straight or gay or straight or queer. It was just attraction. It was just affection. And so when we start thinking about the fact that these things have existed and that they can also be toppled and appended, it becomes very exciting because when you're in a boardroom and you're trying to determine, oh, we have to depict a family in this advertisement, well, this family has to look like this, then you start to question why that is. And you start to realize that we are actively reinforcing these really harmful systems at all times, even when we conceptualize things in a way where Eurocolonialism has told us to do it. We have been told that there's a nuclear family consisting of a mom who's a cisgender woman, a dad who's a cisgender man, and 2.5 kids. That's a construct that has been socially enforced over a long period of time. Sometimes we also conceptualize those people to be white, to be middle class, to be English speaking, to be so-called American, and then erase the vast majority of people who also embody Americanness or family or what it means to be a mother or a father or a non-binary parent. And so I really get down into the history, and it feels like the further back we go, the more abstract it gets. And that's important because when we recognize, like I said, I'm just going to say it again, that when we reinforce those ideas, we are also contributing somewhere down the line to systems of oppression, which is scary, but something to own up to. And then the other side of that is that when we start to complicate those things and dismantle those things in our own understandings, then we can get to a really healthy place of creating systems of liberation where people can see that, hey, that's not what a family has to look like. And it's not to say, hey, those families don't matter. It's to say, hey, those families matter. And so do these thousands of other family arrangements that are just as valid, just as important, and just as worthy as being uplifted. So from Sappho in 600 something BC to Colonimus in 1286 AD to, Stonewall in 1969. Coming back to Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, it is so important that we talk about how, whether it's the construction of race as it was invented over the past 600 years, queerness being something that was tied into indigeneity, interracialization, and I'll break down that just a moment here. It's really fascinating to look at the timeline of the invention of race. This is something that I talk about a lot recently in my book, Read This to Get Smarter. And I've also been in not the most affirming spaces that encourage me to, well, we're just talking about queer people. Can you leave race out of it? We're just talking about women. Can you leave race out of it? Can you leave queerness out of it? But the unfortunate thing is that human beings don't exist in departments. So you can't just go into the accounting department of humanity and forget everything else, because even in that situation, the accounting department has to talk to everybody else, particularly when there's an audit. But business jokes aside, it's interesting to think about how when we look at the Stonewall riots, sometimes we have scholars who look at the movement for Black liberation, the Black Power movement. We look at the movement for Chicano rights. We look at the, Latinx liberation movements. We look at so many different elements, the Brown Power movement, the women's liberation movement. And unfortunately, in non-intersectional understandings of history, there's this propensity to separate these things out, to look at them as different and unique anomalies of history that had nothing to do with each other. But that's not the case, because humanity and history doesn't happen in departments. It happens all at once in this messy flurry of people coming together, sharing ideas, and realizing that we must be connected. My inclination towards telling the truth of history in these intersectional ways has gotten me called an activist historian, which I don't think is, sure, I'll take it, but I don't think it should be something called activism when you're literally just attempting to tell the truth and to show the full showcase of what it means to be part of a community. I was in New York and I was at a cocktail hour. It was during Pride. And I was talking to this older man, and he was talking to me about how, well, back when I was coming out, we didn't have insert this identity, insert that identity. And I said, well, that's interesting, given the fact that the reason we even have these celebrations is because of trans folks, is because of trans folks of color, is because of genderqueer people, is because of Black folks and women coming together. And he did this thing that I often find folks do with me, which is go, oh yeah, which is refusing to admit that you didn't know something, which is fine. But then completely back off that idea. Because when we're part of a community that is so marginalized, what ends up happening sometimes is that people want to get back to that level of privilege they had before they were outed. They want to duplicate a system of oppression, whether they know it or not, where they are on top and that other people are left out. But that's not what queerness is. When we look at these movements coming together, it was the life of Sylvia Rivera being unhoused, having to do survival sex work, being kicked out of her home at a young age for not embodying what she was assigned at birth, to be her true self, to actualize herself, and to face the consequences of that. We have Marsha P. Johnson, who had a slightly more affirming family, but didn't have the most encouraging community. As a young Black woman, as a young Black person who was seeing themselves in ways that they were not assigned to be at birth, but who they were meant to be for the very essence of themselves. And so understanding the fact that these people existed, and then when the Stonewall riots happened, they came with their stories. The Stonewall Inn still exists in New York. Of course, the original one burnt down. There was a massive fire following the Stonewall riots or uprising, whatever terminology you want to use. And it was largely a place, an inn for closeted white gay men, many of whom worked on Wall Street. And there was a common practice of police raiding these places, harassing people, taking money from the tills. And there was kind of the threat of arrest for sodomy laws, for being a social outcast, for being outed, for losing your housing. There are so many laws that still exist in the United States that we're seeing be re-upped around sodomy laws, or around all these very archaic Victorian things. And so this is why we didn't see uprisings happen until we started to see this integration, this forefronting of folks who had this experience of being brutalized by the police in ways that left them fed up with nothing to lose. Not a prestigious or privileged life to cocoon or hold onto, but really just feeling the full vulnerability of what it meant to be out and proud and queer and trans and alive. And so on that night in the Stonewall Inn, when the police came in and raided, regardless of who first threw the first shot glass or the first brick, what happened was a watershed moment of people realizing it doesn't matter how much privilege I have to hold on to if I can't be my actualized self in this moment. And so the Stonewall riots, uprising, was not just a moment when the queer liberation movement started. It was when the homophile movement, which is what it was called at the time, the gay and lesbian movement, became a queer liberation movement. Queer as in no more police violence. Queer as in we're going to challenge the policies that leave people incarcerated, people having to do survival sex work. We're going to challenge these policies. And we're going to challenge this reality. And we're going to realize in this moment that life does not have to be as bad as it has been for us, that we can protect and save other people from having to go through what we have gone through. That's something that Sappho did. That's something that Kalonymus did. That's something that so many people throughout our human history did and were not recorded because it threatens systems of oppression for queer people to be ourselves. And that's why we're seeing these laws passed today. And that's why it is so important that we bring this into our workspaces, we bring this into our homes, we bring these truths in, and we recognize that Pride is, yes, a time for celebration and dancing and glitter, as long as it's biodegradable, and flags, but it's also a time to recognize how powerful it is that we have always been here, that we will always be here. And whether or not we are allowed to learn about ourselves, we will continue to be proud and to be bold and to be brave, whether that braveness looks like having to remain closeted to protect yourself or your family or your job or your home, or actualizing yourself against the threat of those things, because bravery looks like so many different things. And that's what I wanted to drive home today, is just the fact of our power, the fact of our history, the fact of our diversity. That no, we cannot say that the movement for Black power and the queer liberation movement were separate entities, or that the women's liberation movement was a separate entity, that all of these things were happening at the same time, that it was the children of the soldiers who fought during World War II and the Vietnam War, the people who were not able to get access to the American dream because they could not attain the GI Bill, Black and brown youth being denied that dream, Black and brown youth who were immigrants coming up from the Caribbean, Black youth who were coming up from the South into urban centers during the Great Migration, women who were experiencing this distorted reality where their gender assignment at birth dictated how much money they would make and would not make, at the same time as we're seeing technological advances. All of these people being in this amazing place of New York City, witnessing the United States getting ready to take off to the moon, and feeling so left behind and so unseen and unheard in ways that truly mirror what we're seeing today with insert your favorite billionaire going to space. The feeling of being left behind, the feeling of being denied the opportunity to actualize yourself, should drive you. You might feel angry, and that's good. Anger is an emotion like anything else, and it's not about whether that emotion is good or bad. It's about how you express it and use it to fuel you. Use joy to fuel you. Use excitement to fuel you. Use the reality that our liberation, as well as our oppression, are deeply interconnected, and that it's not enough that one group gains a civil right if the other groups are left behind. That we have to connect ourselves intersectionally, which brings me to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, the originator of the term intersectionality, talking about how, in the legal context back in 1989, that women's liberation, that civil rights actions and laws that protected women were ignoring women of color because you could only be one thing at a time. You could only have one axis of oppression. Seeing that movements that uplifted Black people were removing women and LGBTQ plus people, though she mostly wrote about the effect on women. And recognizing that through her own lived experience and expertise as a legal scholar, that the idea of womanhood and Blackness are simultaneously and co-occurring and leave folks like me vulnerable to sexism and racism at the same time in what Dr. Moya Bailey calls misogynoir. And so when we uplift and fight for ourselves, we must be fighting for other people. If we are not fighting for other people, then we are just trying to duplicate a system that leaves us on top and disregards everyone else. And that's why it must be connected, because it already is. And honoring that in everything you do, whether it's putting together a pitch deck or creating an ad or looking at who you're hiring, leaving someone out of the table when you already have access to it is not what we're called to do as part of this queer and liberated reality. And so now I want to lead you through a bit of an exercise of understanding ourselves through all these different aspects of who we are and who we know ourselves to be. So I want to tell a little bit of a story before I go into this exercise. Um, During 2020, I went very viral. There was an increased interest in Black liberation, intersectionality, anti-oppression discussions. So many of us have not had the opportunity to not live that reality. We didn't get to wake up one morning and decide that we cared because our lives were at risk. Our opportunity to succeed was at risk. And that's not something that we could just not pay attention to. But because of the pandemic, because of so many different circumstances all coalescing and coming together, the fact that musicians were not making music, the fact that movies were not something we could distract ourselves with, that that so many things were happening. So many people had to take a seat, and examine how they showed up in the world, and that they were not doing enough to show up for their fellow human. And unfortunately, there are so many people today who have let go of those promises they made to themselves, to their communities. And as this was happening and I was experiencing this increased interest in my work and my community, I started to try to find ways to distract myself because I'm a human being and you can't just be doing work 24/7. And I was reading this book by a woman named Margaret Halsey. It was called Colorblind. The White Woman Looks at the Negro. It's a terrible book. I don't recommend it, but it was enlightening. It's a pre-civil rights movement book about anti-racist, activity. And this woman integrated integrated a bar, a cantina during World War II. She had the Black soldiers and the white soldiers sitting in together. She had dancers coming in to dance with the young men who were fighting the war. And there's so much in it where you're seeing, oh my gosh, you got it, and then a complete backtrack. Some of those things including that we should not marginalize, or this is totally a paraphrase, I don't think she used the word marginalize at all, but we shouldn't shame or look down upon Black people. Black people have different features like darker skin, curlier hair, wider noses. And then she would say something super pseudoscientific like how Black people sweat differently and our sweat smells differently, which is a racist belief that a lot of people have held for a long time. But what was astounding to me was that in her action section, the last chapter of the book, she talks about ways that we can improve fighting anti-racism, or the Negro problem, as it was called at that time. And she talked about hiring Black speakers, reading books by Black people, donating money, but not too much money. In her words, the organizations wouldn't know what to do with it. Integrating schools with not one Black child, because that's too much pressure on the one kid, but not more than 3. And just so many of these things that were at the time, I'm sure revolutionary, and left her feeling so bold and socially conscious that she should write this book and print it. And at the same time, there was a failure to reflect and to look at how she showed up in those moments. Why was it her, a white woman, who needed to be the enlightener of these things? Was it actually even revolutionary if the same racists who were racist to Black people only wanted to hear a white woman's experience of racism through the eyes and ears of other people? Like, there was so little self reflection and self concept. And so, from that, as well as through my sobriety journey, I started to recognize the role of our own selves in this whole context. So, when we imagine ourselves and we meditate on who we are and who other people know us to be, we get into these sociological concepts of personal identity and social identity. So I want to lead you through this exercise now that we have this very rich history of LGBTQ plus history and organizing to examine, and then also look at ourselves within that context. So often we're invited to look at ourselves through the context of our job. What do you do? What is your job? How many degrees do you have? What do you like? All of these different things. And I find that it can be very capitalistic. During the pandemic, so many of us were without work and had to really understand ourselves outside of, what do I do to make money? What do I do to enjoy myself? Maybe what am I creative about? What do I enjoy? What are my values? What are my religious beliefs? What are my morals? What are my secular beliefs? What is my gender identity? What pronouns do I use? Do I use pronouns? What is my name? Do I like my name? All of these questions that maybe if you didn't ask yourself then, you can start asking yourself now, because there's no better time to understand who you are than immediately, because you are you. And you wake up with you go to sleep as you come into the world as you. And the way that I've conceptualized all of this, I'm going to go over personal identity and social identity, but then I want to go through an exercise, and I hope you'll humor me and take it seriously, because it can be a really beautiful way of understanding ourselves and also other people. So, personal identity is the way a person perceives themselves. So, how do I view myself? That can change from day to day. That's totally allowed. But even though, well, let's go into to social identity. So, social identity is the way that others perceive us. Personal identity relate to the things that make you uniquely you, such as your beliefs, your interests, gender identity, sexual orientation, racialized background, etc., etc. And identity formation is very connected to socialization. So how you understand in one context, how you understand yourself in one context may completely change. That goes back to what I was talking about how so many young queer people are, one, being denied or about to be denied as of August in Florida, the opportunity to learn about themselves in a school setting. How so many of us don't learn about figures like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, or watershed moments like the Stonewall riots, until college, if we get to college, because again, college is very expensive. And so while it is connected to socialization, we are ultimately, we, you, me, I decide who I am, you decide who you are. So we should determine and define our personal identity. Sometimes we don't have the language to do so. When I was a young person, I understood myself to be a lesbian, primarily because I didn't know bisexuality was a thing. And there were these quizzes online and the horrible Kenzie test, which at the time was very important in the time period where it came out in this past century. But to understanding yourself as 60% straight and 40% gay or whatever was not the way to understand identity. Certainly is very biphobic, but I didn't have the words. So while yes, we define our personal identity, it's so important to have representation, to have role models in various different ways so that we can recognize that, hey, it's not weird that I don't want to be with Aladdin, I want to be with Jasmine. And that if I want to be with Prince Charming from that other show, then maybe I can be a whole person instead of feeling like I was an inadequate lesbian, understanding myself to be bisexual and to fight through my biphobia. So there's our personal identity, as well as a fun little story from my past. And then we have social identity. And this is what is dictated by those around us. It connects to the concept of social belonging. We might have to be different versions of ourselves in these different contexts, whether it is who you are at home, who you are at work, who you are at school, who you are on social media. In my case, I try to be the same person in all those contexts, but it might involve code switching. It might involve trying to or having to fulfill the expectations that somebody else has set upon you, not because you want to, but because you have to survive. And so social identity is often prioritized above personal identity in social situations. And social identity can encompass some or even many parts of our identity. It doesn't always, because who we understand ourselves to be does not always match the way others understand us. So, for example, I'm a bisexual woman, and I am sometimes not understood to be bisexual because some people don't think it exists or know it exists, or it's not, and what it isn't is a personal failure to be bisexual enough, but it's due to bi erasure. And erasure, stereotyping, oppressive systems mean that sometimes we are perceived in ways that do not always align with who we are. When it comes to things like misgendering or feeling like your experience has been dismissed or delegitimized, it's so important to remember that those things are not because of us. That's not our fault. It's not because you didn't present in a certain way. It is the fact that society expects you to present in a certain way. That is the issue, not that you didn't fulfill an expectation that is constantly moving like goalposts that cannot be met. If we don't learn about people like Sappho, like Colonimus, if we don't learn about recent figures like Georgia Black, who was a woman who just lived and died as a Black transgender woman before integration happened during the 1950s, the fact that she existed is revolutionary, but is not discussed because she just was, and is also sometimes hidden because she and sometimes we threaten these oppressive systems that tell us there's only one way to exist, when the fact is there are infinite ways to exist. There's infinite diversity and infinite combinations, to use um, a Star Trek phrase. But understanding ourselves is so key, because when it comes to things like privilege, when it comes to things like our participation, our power dynamics, our baggage, our trauma, our cultural context, how we understand ourselves may not be how other people understand us. And that's not our fault, but it is something to be aware of, something even to reflect on. Equipping ourselves with these understandings and determining where we fit into this matrix of domination, as Patricia Hill Collins, I believe, discussed, is so important when it comes to looking at intersectionality. It's also important for answering this call of history, thinking about the ways that we try to hold on to privilege, that we might contribute to systems of oppression, that we might hold our tongue in a meeting, and recognize whether it's because you're trying to survive or because you might have become complacent. That's not a determination I can make or that anyone can make for you. But it's something to think about, to be actively thinking about, and to sit with the fact that being out and being equal are things that we deserve, things that we have a right to, and that simultaneously it is on society, it is on all of us as part of a society to create a world where we accept, affirm, and uplift people for exactly who they are, instead of waiting for them to subvert an expectation that we have placed onto them. That it's not a matter of us coming out to prove something or to stop living a lie or to be ourselves. We are already being ourselves. But creating the space for people to actualize themselves, to be public about who they are and who they love if they want to, how they express themselves if they want to, and not having those expectations where people are either straight or cisgender unless proven otherwise or demonstrated otherwise. So I hope you sit with those things. I hope you imagine yourself uh, with your personal identity and your social identity. And before I go, I do want to do the exercise. I've had so many people do this exercise. It's the flower with many petals. And so understand yourself as this flower. I picture myself as a sunflower. You can tell because of the yellow, but it's just kind of my vibe. But also, I very much like to have a spot close to the sun. And so when you consider your personal identity and your social identity, I think of it as this flower with many petals. You can picture yourself as your favorite flower. And imagine the components that comprise you, whether they are personal or social identities, are the petals on that flower. And my petals represent my gender identity as a woman, my sexual orientation is bisexual, my religious identity is Muslim, racialized identity is Black, I speak English, I love Elton John, my relationships, the fact that I'm from the US, all of these different things, and so many things that are personal. You do not have to share every petal of your flower with every person. And if you have yet to have the opportunity to bloom, that's not on you. That's because of your circumstances. That's because of the ways that you've been able to nourish yourself or not have the opportunity to. And we think of ourselves in this way. It's a good reminder that we might not be seeing every element of who somebody is. We might not even recognize who all we are yet. And if we can understand that when we come together as this bouquet, as this arrangement, then it is the responsibility of the sunflowers to take a step back and for the shrinking violets to be able to take a step forward if they so choose. And to make sure that people are able to express themselves and to be themselves and to arrange themselves in ways that make sure that we all get a spot in the sun if we want it, to just be ourselves. That's what it means to be out and to be equal. And we can't do any of that work unless we understand who we are before we go into it. Or else we risk being like Margaret Halsey, the white woman takes a look at the Negro. We want to make sure that we are uplifting and advocating for people on their terms, not on ours, treating people how they want to be treated, not treating them how we would want to be treated, because it's different. We're different people, we're different flowers. So here's hoping that we can all bloom, that we can all tap into our queer ancestors like Sappho, like Holonomous, like Sylvia Rivera, like Marsha P. Johnson, and like the many people who were not recorded in history because they simply lived and threatened those systems of oppression. So I hope you go out and threaten some systems of oppression. I hope that you go and do some good trouble, as Congressman John Lewis talked about. And I thank you all so much for having me. Thank you to Out and Equal. And yeah, let's do some good trouble and make that world where people can just be themselves because we deserve it. Thank you.